Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping back in time, way back, to an era that would test every fibre of human survival instinct. We're talking about life 20,000 years ago, during the height of the last ice age, when our ancestors faced challenges that make our worst day look like a casual stroll through the park. If you think you're tough enough to handle modern life, wait until you see what these people endured just to see another sunrise. Before we dive into this frozen world, I'd really appreciate it if you could hit that like button and subscribe if you're enjoying this journey through time. I'm always curious about where you're all watching from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there right now. It's fascinating to connect with people from all over the globe who share this passion for history. Now dim those lights, maybe put on some background sounds, and let's transport ourselves to a world where survival wasn't guaranteed, where every decision could mean the difference between life and death, and where the very concept of comfort was as foreign as the idea of a heated home. Picture this. You've just opened your eyes in the year 18,000 BCE. The first thing that hits you isn't the sight, it's the cold. Bone-chilling, breath-stealing cold that seems to seep through every layer of hide and fur you're wrapped in. Your shelter, if you can call it that, is a carefully constructed dome of mammoth bones covered with thick animal skins. And even inside this architectural marvel, you can see your breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Outside, the landscape stretches endlessly in shades of white and grey. Massive glaciers tower in the distance, their blue-white faces gleaming like frozen cathedrals. The wind howls constantly, a sound that's become as familiar as your own heartbeat, carrying with it the promise of death for anyone foolish enough to venture out unprepared. This isn't just winter as you might know it. This is an ice age, and it's been going on for thousands upon thousands of years. Your family, your tribe, they're all huddled together in this space that's smaller than most modern bathrooms, yet it represents the pinnacle of ice age engineering. Every bone in these walls was carefully selected, every hide meticulously prepared, every joint sealed against the killing wind. This shelter didn't just happen overnight. It took weeks of backbreaking labor, and the knowledge passed down through countless generations of survivors who learned, adapted, and passed on the secrets of staying alive in the most hostile environment Earth had ever thrown at humanity. But here's what makes this story absolutely incredible. These weren't primitive cave dwellers scratching out a miserable existence. These were sophisticated hunters, master craftsmen, and ingenious architects who developed technologies so advanced that modern survival experts study their techniques today. They didn't just survive the Ice Age, they thrived in it, creating art, developing complex social structures, and pushing the boundaries of human habitation into regions that should have been uninhabitable. The mammoth bone houses of Eastern Europe weren't crude huts. They were engineering marvels that could house extended families through the harshest winters in human history. Some of these structures were over 15 feet in diameter, with multiple rooms, storage areas, and sophisticated heating systems that maximized warmth while conserving precious fuel. The builders understood principles of insulation, air circulation, and structural engineering that wouldn't be formally studied until thousands of years later. Think about that for a moment. While most of the world was locked under ice sheets hundreds of feet thick, these people were creating homes that were not just functional, but comfortable. They had figured out how to trap warm air, how to prevent condensation from freezing inside their living spaces, and how to create ventilation systems that brought in fresh air without letting in the deadly cold. But survival wasn't just about shelter. Every single day brought life or death decisions. What to hunt, where to hunt it, how to preserve the meat, how to prepare for the next storm that could last for weeks. These weren't choices made in comfort around a conference table. These were split-second decisions made by people whose lives depended on reading the environment like a book written in ice and wind. The hunters of 20,000 years ago faced prey that dwarfed anything we see today. Woolly mammoths stood 11 feet tall at the shoulder and weighed as much as a modern truck. These weren't just big elephants with fur. They were massive, intelligent, dangerous animals with curved tusks that could impale a human with a casual swing of their enormous heads. Cave bears were larger than modern grizzlies, with claws that could tear through hide and bone. Saber-toothed cats prowled the edges of human settlements, patient predators that could kill with surgical precision. Yet somehow, armed with nothing more than stone-tipped spears, carefully crafted throwing sticks, and an intimate knowledge of animal behavior, these Ice Age hunters brought down the largest land animals that ever lived. They didn't do it through brute force. They did it through intelligence, cooperation, and strategies so sophisticated that anthropologists are still trying to understand exactly how they worked. Consider the logistics of a mammoth hunt. A single adult mammoth provided enough meat to feed a tribe of 30 people for months, but only if that meat could be properly preserved and stored. In a world without refrigeration, this meant smoking, drying, and freezing techniques that had to work perfectly every single time. One mistake, one miscalculation in the preservation process, and the entire tribe could starve before the next successful hunt. The tools they used weren't crude chunks of chipped stone. They were precision instruments, each one crafted for a specific purpose. Spear points were designed with exact angles to penetrate thick hide and reach vital organs. Scrapers were shaped to remove every usable piece of meat from bones. Needles, carved from bone and antler, were so fine they could sew waterproof seams in clothing that had to keep people alive in temperatures that regularly dropped 40 degrees below freezing. And the clothing itself was a marvel of engineering. Multiple layers of carefully prepared furs, each serving a specific function. Inner layers of soft rabbit or fox fur against the skin for warmth and comfort. Middle layers of deer or reindeer hide for insulation and flexibility. Outer layers of thick mammoth or bear hide for wind and water resistance. Every seam was sealed with animal sinew, every edge reinforced with strips of leather that could withstand the constant stress of daily survival activities. But perhaps most remarkably, these people didn't just survive the Ice Age physically. They survived it mentally and culturally. They created art that still moves us today. Cave paintings that capture not just the appearance of the animals they hunted, but their movement, their behavior, their essence. Carved figurines that show an understanding of human form and beauty that wouldn't be matched again for thousands of years. They developed music, creating flutes from bird bones and mammoth ivory that could produce haunting melodies in the darkness of the endless winter nights. They told stories, passing down through generations the accumulated wisdom of survival, the locations of the best hunting grounds, the signs that predicted weather changes, the techniques for working stone and bone and hide into the tools that kept them alive. These stories weren't just entertainment around the fire. They were survival manuals disguised as mythology, encoding crucial information in memorable narratives that could be passed from parent to child across generations. A story about a hero following animal tracks might contain detailed information about reading sign and predicting animal behavior. A tale of spirits controlling the weather might include sophisticated knowledge about reading atmospheric conditions and preparing for storms. The social structures they developed were equally sophisticated. Leadership wasn't based on simple dominance, but on expertise and wisdom. The best hunters led hunts, but the best toolmakers guided the creation of weapons and implements. The most experienced elders made decisions about when to move camp, where to establish winter shelters, and how to allocate resources during times of scarcity. Women weren't relegated to secondary roles. They were often the keepers of crucial knowledge about plant foods, medicine, and hide preparation. In many tribes, women were the primary toolmakers, creating the needles, scrapers, and specialized implements that made daily life possible. Some were hunters themselves, particularly skilled at tracking smaller game and understanding the behavior of the animals that provided not just food, but the materials for clothing, tools and shelter. Children weren't just dependents to be fed and protected. They were apprentices from the moment they could walk, learning by observation and participation the thousands of skills necessary for survival. By the time they reached adolescence, they possessed knowledge that modern survival experts spend decades trying to acquire. Every aspect of their lives was interconnected in ways that modern people can barely comprehend. The choice of hunting grounds affected not just food supply, but access to tool-making materials, shelter construction resources, and trade opportunities with other groups. The timing of seasonal movements had to account for weather patterns, animal migration routes, and the availability of plant foods and raw materials. They lived in a world where waste was not just impractical, it was potentially fatal. Every part of every animal was used. Bones became tools, needles, and structural elements for shelters. Hide became clothing, containers, and rope. Sinew became thread and bowstrings. Fat became fuel for lamps and waterproofing for seams. Even the contents of animal stomachs were used, providing partially digested plant material that supplemented their heavily meat-based diet with essential nutrients. The level of planning required for survival staggers the modern mind. Summer activities weren't just about immediate needs, but about preparing for the coming winter. Every berry picked and dried, every hide properly processed, every tool crafted and maintained, every piece of firewood gathered and stored, was an investment in surviving the months of killing cold that lay ahead. And yet, for all their focus on survival, these people found time and energy for beauty, for art, for music, for storytelling, for the things that made them human rather than just clever animals. They carved decorative patterns into their tools, not because decoration made them work better, but because beauty mattered, even in a world of constant hardship. The shelters they built weren't just functional, they were homes, spaces arranged for social interaction, for family life, for the rituals and ceremonies that bound communities together. Archaeological evidence shows that they arranged their living spaces with care, creating distinct areas for different activities, decorating walls with pigments and carvings, and organizing their possessions in ways that spoke of pride and aesthetic sense. This was humanity at its most resourceful, most resilient, most ingeniously adaptive. These weren't desperate people barely clinging to life. These were master survivors who had turned one of the most challenging environments in Earth's history into a homeland, who had looked at a world of ice and wind and predators, and decided not just to survive, but to flourish. In our next segment, we'll dive deep into the daily reality of Ice Age life, exploring exactly how these remarkable people managed to not just stay alive, but build thriving communities in conditions that would challenge even our most advanced modern survival technology. The morning routine of an Ice Age hunter began before dawn, not by choice, but by necessity. In a world where daylight was precious and short, especially during the brutal winter months, every moment of available light had to be maximized. You'd wake to the sound of wind battering your shelter, a constant reminder that the world outside was actively trying to kill you. But here's what's fascinating about these people. They didn't just react to their environment, they anticipated it. Weather prediction wasn't a convenience. It was a survival skill that could determine whether your entire tribe lived or died. These hunters could read the sky like a detailed map, interpreting cloud formations, wind patterns, and atmospheric pressure changes with an accuracy that would impress modern meteorologists. They knew that certain cloud shapes meant a blizzard was coming in 2 days. They could feel in their bones when the temperature was about to drop another 10 degrees. They understood that specific wind directions brought different types of storms, and they planned their activities accordingly. This wasn't superstition or luck. This was accumulated knowledge passed down through thousands of years of people who had learned to read nature's signals or died trying. The decision of when to hunt wasn't made casually over morning coffee. It was a calculated risk assessment that involved reading animal tracks that might be days old, understanding migration patterns that changed with the seasons, and knowing exactly how far the hunting party could travel from base camp and still make it back before nightfall or the next storm hit. Consider the complexity of tracking a mammoth herd across frozen terrain. These massive animals left obvious signs, sure, but reading those signs required expertise that took decades to develop. The age of the tracks, the direction of travel, the spacing between footprints that indicated whether the animals were moving casually or fleeing from predators. The depth of the impressions that revealed how much weight each animal was carrying, and therefore its health and vulnerability. But mammoth hunting wasn't a solo activity or even a small group effort. It required coordinated teamwork on a scale that would challenge modern military units. Hunting parties of 20 to 30 people had to move across treacherous terrain while maintaining perfect communication and coordination, often over distances of several miles and in weather conditions that made visibility nearly zero. The weapons they carried weren't just sharp sticks. These were precision tools that represented hundreds of hours of careful craftsmanship. Spear points were knapped from specific types of stone that had been traded across vast distances, each type chosen for its particular properties. Some stones held the sharpest edges, others were more durable, still others were easier to work, but required more frequent maintenance. The hafting of these points onto wooden shafts was an art form in itself. The connection had to be strong enough to withstand the massive impact of striking a charging mammoth, yet flexible enough not to shatter on contact. They used complex binding techniques with sinew and plant fibers, often reinforced with pine pitch or other natural adhesives that maintained their properties even in extreme cold. And then there was the strategy. You couldn't just walk up to a mammoth and start stabbing. These animals were intelligent, protective of their young, and capable of coordinated defense. A single mammoth could kill multiple hunters with one sweep of its tusks or one stomp of its massive feet. The hunters had to understand mammoth behavior intimately, knowing when the animals were most vulnerable, how they reacted to threats, and how to separate individual animals from the protective herd. Some evidence suggests they used fire as a hunting tool, not just for warmth and cooking, but as a way to direct animal movement. Controlled burns could create barriers that funneled prey toward waiting hunters, or create areas of new grass growth that would attract grazing animals to specific locations. This required understanding not just of animal behavior, but of plant ecology, weather patterns, and fire management techniques that were incredibly sophisticated. The actual kill was just the beginning of the real work. A dead mammoth represented thousands of pounds of meat, hide, bone, and other materials, but only if it could be processed quickly and efficiently before scavengers arrived or the meat began to spoil. In summer, this meant working frantically in teams to butcher the animal and transport the usable parts back to camp before flies and bacteria could ruin the meat. In winter, freezing temperatures provided natural refrigeration, but created their own challenges as the carcass became literally rock hard, requiring specialized tools and techniques to break down. Every part of the processing required specific knowledge and skills. Which cuts of meat were best for immediate consumption, which could be dried or smoked for long-term storage, which organs contained essential nutrients that couldn't be obtained elsewhere in their diet. The hide had to be removed in specific patterns that would yield the largest possible pieces for clothing and shelter construction, but without damaging the skin in ways that would create weak points in the final products. The bones weren't just discarded waste. They were raw materials for tools, weapons, and construction projects. Different bones had different properties and uses. Long bones could be split and shaped into spear points or needles. Flat bones became scrapers and cutting implements. Large bones were saved for construction projects, either as structural elements for shelters or as raw material for carving into specialized tools. Even the mammoth's hair wasn't wasted. The coarse outer hair could be woven into rope or used as insulation material. The softer undercoat provided material for clothing or bedding. The tail hair was particularly prized for making strong, flexible cordage that could be used for everything from bowstrings to fishing lines. But perhaps most remarkably, these people had developed preservation techniques that allowed them to store meat for months without refrigeration. Smoking wasn't just hanging meat over a fire. It was a complex process that required understanding exactly which types of wood produce the right kinds of smoke, how to maintain consistent temperatures over days or weeks, and how to create the proper air circulation to prevent spoilage while ensuring complete preservation. Pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, fat, and sometimes berries, was their equivalent of modern energy bars, but far more sophisticated. The ratios had to be exact to prevent spoilage and provide maximum nutrition. Too little fat and the mixture would crumble and spoil quickly. Too much and it would become rancid. The meat had to be dried to exactly the right consistency, the fat rendered and purified to remove any water that could cause bacterial growth. These preservation techniques weren't just about food security, they were about mobility. A hunting band might need to move quickly to follow herds or escape changing weather conditions. Having portable, nutritious food that wouldn't spoil allowed them to travel for days or weeks without having to stop to hunt, giving them flexibility and options that meant the difference between life and death. The social dynamics of these preservation activities reveal another layer of sophistication in Ice Age society. The work of processing a mammoth kill involved the entire community, with specific tasks assigned based on expertise and physical capability. The most experienced butchers directed the initial breakdown of the carcass. Skilled hide workers took charge of skin removal and initial processing. Others managed the fires and smoking operations. Children and adolescents performed support tasks, while learning the skills they would need as adults. But this wasn't just about efficiency, it was about social cohesion. Shared labor created bonds between community members, reinforced hierarchies based on skill and experience, and provided opportunities for knowledge transfer between generations. The stories told during these long processing sessions weren't just entertainment. They were educational opportunities where younger members learned not just techniques, but the reasoning behind different approaches and the consequences of mistakes. The distribution of meat and materials from successful hunts reveals complex social structures that balanced individual contribution with community needs. Skilled hunters might receive choice portions, but not at the expense of families with young children or elderly members who couldn't contribute as much physical labor. Widows and orphans weren't abandoned. They were integrated into the community's support system in ways that ensured their survival while maintaining their dignity and social standing. These distribution systems had to account for seasonal variations in hunting success and community needs. During abundant times, more could be allocated to individual preferences and trade with other groups. During scarcity, strict rationing ensured that everyone received enough to survive, even if it meant personal sacrifice for the most productive community members. The psychological aspects of Ice Age life were as challenging as the physical demands. Modern people struggle with seasonal depression. During mild winters with heated homes and electric lighting, imagine the mental health challenges of living through months of near-constant darkness and temperatures that could kill you in minutes of exposure, knowing that one mistake, one injury, one stroke of bad luck could doom not just you, but your entire family. Yet archaeological evidence suggests these people maintained rich emotional and spiritual lives. They created art that expressed not just practical knowledge, but abstract concepts, emotions, and beliefs about the world around them. They developed music and dance traditions that brought communities together during the darkest months, providing psychological relief from the constant stress of survival. They buried their dead with ceremony and grave goods, suggesting beliefs about afterlife and spiritual continuation that provided comfort in the face of constant mortality. They cared for disabled community members. Archaeological evidence shows individuals with severe injuries or developmental conditions who lived for years with community support. indicating value systems that prioritized human dignity over pure practical utility. The seasonal cycles that governed their lives created rhythms and anticipation that provided psychological structure in what could otherwise have been overwhelming uncertainty. Spring meant the return of longer days, the possibility of plant foods, and the migration of animals that had been absent during winter. Summer brought intensive activity, gathering and preserving resources, but also opportunities for social interaction with other groups, trade, and cultural exchange. Autumn was a time of final preparation, the last chance to gather resources and complete projects before winter made such activities impossible. But it was also harvest time, when the work of previous months paid off in stored food and materials that would sustain the community through the dark months ahead. Winter itself, for all its dangers and hardships, provided opportunities for activities that were impossible during the busy seasons. Toolmaking and repair, storytelling and cultural transmission, planning for the next year's activities, and the deep social bonding that came from sharing confined spaces and complete dependence on one another. These seasonal rhythms created a framework for psychological survival that was as important as physical preparation. People knew what to expect, when to expect it, and how to prepare mentally as well as practically for the challenges ahead. This predictability provided stability in an otherwise uncertain world, anchoring communities in patterns that had proven successful over countless generations. The trading relationships these Ice Age communities maintained with other groups reveal another dimension of their sophisticated social organization. Raw materials for toolmaking might travel hundreds of miles from their sources, following trade networks that spanned entire continents. These weren't casual exchanges, but complex relationships that required trust, communication across language barriers, and understanding of relative values that could account for seasonal variations and regional differences. Some groups specialized in producing specific types of tools or materials that were highly prized across vast regions. Obsidian from volcanic sources might be traded across thousands of miles, prized for its ability to hold edges sharper than modern surgical steel. Amber from coastal regions was valued not just for decoration, but for its static properties that made it useful in certain tool-making applications. High-quality flint from specific quarries became the foundation of entire regional economies. These trade relationships weren't just about materials, they were about information. News of animal movements, weather patterns, and resource availability traveled along these networks faster than any individual group could scout. A mammoth herd spotted 300 miles away might influence hunting decisions weeks before the animals actually arrived in a region. Knowledge of particularly harsh winters or abundant summers in distant areas helped communities prepare for similar conditions that might be heading their way. The social protocols surrounding trade were elaborate and carefully maintained. Gift-giving ceremonies established relationships before any actual bargaining began. Specific individuals within communities became specialists in trade negotiations, developing reputations that could span generations. The ability to accurately assess the quality of materials and the fairness of exchanges was a skill as valuable as hunting prowess or tool-making expertise. Marriage and kinship ties often followed these trade routes, creating networks of family relationships that stretched across enormous distances. A young woman might marry into a group several hundred miles away, bringing with her not just genetic diversity, but knowledge of different techniques, access to different resource bases, and connections that could prove crucial during times of crisis. These marriage exchanges weren't random romantic connections. They were carefully negotiated alliances that considered the needs of both communities. A group with excellent mammoth hunting grounds might exchange daughters with a community that had superior access to stone tool materials or plant food resources. The children of these unions inherited knowledge and connections from both sides, becoming bridges between communities that strengthened the overall network of human survival. The languages spoken by these Ice Age peoples were likely far more complex and sophisticated than we often imagine. They needed vocabulary to describe dozens of different types of snow and ice conditions, each with specific implications for travel, hunting, and shelter construction. They had words for animal behaviors that modern hunters have forgotten. Terms that described the subtle differences in track patterns that revealed whether an animal was injured, pregnant, or being stalked by predators. Their languages carried the accumulated wisdom of generations in their very structure. Verb tenses that indicated not just when something happened, but the reliability of the information and the experience level of the speaker. Noun classifications that automatically conveyed information about seasonal availability, danger levels, and practical uses of different resources. The oral traditions that preserved this linguistic complexity were marvels of human memory and cultural transmission, epic poems that could take days to recite in full, containing not just entertainment, but detailed survival information embedded in memorable narrative structures. Genealogies that traced family relationships back dozens of generations, preserving not just ancestry, but information about alliances, obligations, and access rights to specific territories and resources. Children in these communities didn't just learn their native languages. They often acquired multiple dialects and even entirely different languages through contact with trading partners and marriage relationships. Being multilingual wasn't an academic achievement. It was a survival skill that could mean the difference between successful negotiation and deadly misunderstanding when encountering unfamiliar groups. The tool-making traditions of these Ice Age craftsmen represent some of the most sophisticated technologies ever developed with simple hand tools. Creating a properly balanced spear required understanding physics principles that wouldn't be formally described until thousands of years later. The shaft had to be straight enough for accuracy, but flexible enough to absorb the shock of impact. The point had to be secured firmly enough to penetrate thick hide, but designed to detach cleanly if the weapon became embedded in a wounded animal. Composite tools that combined multiple materials pushed the boundaries of what was possible with Stone Age technology. Spear throwers that multiplied the force and accuracy of thrown weapons used leverage principles that increased effective hunting range by hundreds of yards. Harpoons with detachable heads connected by strong cordage allowed hunters to maintain connection with wounded prey while avoiding the dangerous close combat that killed so many hunters. The specialized tools required for different aspects of survival numbered in the hundreds, each designed for specific tasks and crafted to exacting standards. Hide scrapers with precisely angled edges that could remove flesh and fat without damaging the skin. Bone needles so fine they could create waterproof seams in the heaviest winter clothing. Cutting implements shaped for everything from butchering massive carcasses to performing delicate surgical procedures on injured community members. The knowledge required to create these tools wasn't just technical, it was deeply artistic. The most skilled craftsmen developed personal styles that were recognizable across generations. Specific techniques for knapping stone, working bone, and shaping wood became family traditions passed from parent to child through hands-on apprenticeships that lasted for years. Quality control in toolmaking was literally a matter of life and death. A spear point that shattered during a crucial hunt could mean starvation for an entire community. A needle that broke while sewing winter clothing could result in gaps that let in killing cold. The testing and quality assurance procedures these craftsmen developed were rigorous and unforgiving because the consequences of failure were so severe. The repair and maintenance of tools was as important as their initial creation. In a world where replacement materials might not be available for months, keeping existing tools functional required constant attention and innovative problem solving. Broken spear points were reworked into smaller tools rather than discarded. Worn cutting edges were resharpened and reshaped multiple times before the tool was finally retired. Even the waste products from tool making were valuable resources. Stone chips from knapping sessions became small cutting implements or were used as components in composite tools. Bone shavings were saved for glue making or as raw material for tiny specialized implements. Wood shavings became tinder for fire starting or stuffing for insulation. The workshops where this tool making took place weren't casual corners of living spaces. They were specialized areas designed for maximum efficiency and safety. Proper lighting was crucial for detailed work, requiring careful arrangement of oil lamps or positioning near openings that provided natural light without creating drafts that could extinguish flames. Work surfaces were organized with the precision of modern surgical suites, with specific places for different materials and tools that allowed craftsmen to work efficiently even in low light conditions. The social status of master craftsmen in these communities was comparable to that of the most successful hunters. Their skills were recognized and rewarded with choice portions of meat, the best raw materials, and often leadership roles in community decision-making. The most talented toolmakers became regional celebrities, their products sought after by groups across vast distances, and their techniques studied and copied by aspiring craftsmen throughout their known world. Apprenticeship in toolmaking began in early childhood and continued through adolescence and into early adulthood. Young people learned not just the physical techniques, but the mental discipline required for precision work, the patience to complete projects that might take weeks or months, and the critical evaluation skills needed to assess their own work honestly and identify areas for improvement. The ceremonies surrounding the completion of masterwork tools reflected their importance in community life. A young person's first successfully completed spear point or perfectly sewn garment marked important transitions toward adult status. The presentation of specially crafted tools as gifts sealed marriages, confirmed alliances, and honored achievements in ways that created lasting social bonds. Innovation in tool design wasn't discouraged, but it was approached carefully and systematically. New techniques were tested thoroughly on practice materials before being applied to crucial projects. Improvements were shared within communities and along trade networks, but always with careful attention to proven reliability. The balance between innovation and tradition reflected the reality that while new techniques might offer advantages, proven methods had the weight of generations of successful survival behind them. The seasonal cycles that governed toolmaking reflected the broader rhythms of Ice Age life. Summer was the time for gathering raw materials, when travel was possible and distant quarries could be accessed. Autumn brought intensive tool production, preparing for the winter months when outdoor activities would be limited and equipment failures could be fatal. Winter provided opportunities for detailed work on complex projects that required sustained attention, while spring was the time for maintenance and repair of tools that had been stressed by winter use. The integration of tool making with other survival activities created efficiencies that maximized the use of limited time and resources. Hunting expeditions planned their routes to pass by known sources of tool-making materials. Processing activities for food preparation were scheduled to provide raw materials for tool construction at optimal times. Even the timing of social gatherings was influenced by the need to coordinate tool-making activities that required multiple specialists working together. The psychological aspects of craftsmanship provided crucial mental health benefits in the stressful environment of Ice Age survival. The focused concentration required for detailed work provided relief from constant anxiety about survival. The satisfaction of creating beautiful and functional objects gave people a sense of accomplishment and control in a world where so much was unpredictable and dangerous. The social recognition that came with superior craftsmanship provided status and self-worth that helped individuals maintain psychological stability through the darkest and most challenging periods. The artistic achievements of these Ice Age communities represent one of humanity's most remarkable cultural explosions, emerging not despite their harsh living conditions, but perhaps because of them. When every waking moment wasn't consumed by immediate survival needs, these people channeled their extraordinary skills and intelligence into creating beauty that still moves us 20,000 years later. The cave paintings discovered across Europe aren't primitive scribbles on stone walls. They're sophisticated artistic achievements that demonstrate mastery of technique, composition, and symbolic representation that rivals anything produced by later civilizations. The artists who created these works understood perspective, proportion, and the use of natural cave formations to create three-dimensional effects that make painted animals appear to move in flickering firelight. But here's what's truly staggering about these artistic traditions. The pigments used in cave paintings weren't just whatever colored dirt happened to be lying around. These artists developed complex recipes for paints that required gathering materials from dozens of different sources, sometimes traveling hundreds of miles to obtain specific minerals and organic compounds. Red ochre from iron-rich deposits, black from manganese oxides or charcoal prepared in specific ways, yellow from particular clay formations that had exactly the right consistency and color saturation. The preparation of these pigments was as sophisticated as any medieval illuminator's workshop. Different binding agents were used to create paints with specific properties. Some needed to flow smoothly for broad washes of color. Others had to maintain precise lines for detailed work. Some were designed to penetrate deep into stone surfaces for permanence. Others were formulated to sit on top of the rock for specific visual effects. The tools used for painting were equally specialized. Brushes made from animal hair that was selected and prepared for specific stroke characteristics. Hollow bones that served as primitive airbrushes, allowing artists to create graduated color effects and soft edges that modern painters struggled to achieve with advanced equipment. Stamps and stencils carved from stone or bone that allowed for precise repetition of specific patterns and designs. The subject matter of these paintings reveals intimate knowledge of animal behavior that goes far beyond what was necessary for hunting. Artists captured the subtle differences in posture that indicated whether an animal was alert, feeding, or preparing to flee. They understood the seasonal variations in coat thickness and color that affected how animals appeared at different times of year. They portrayed the social dynamics of herds, showing dominant animals, protective behaviors, and the complex relationships between different species. Some paintings show animals in motion with such accuracy that modern high-speed photography confirms details that the artists somehow observed and remembered with perfect precision. Galloping horses with all 4 feet off the ground in exactly the correct positions. Birds captured at the precise moment of takeoff with wing positions that reveal deep understanding of flight mechanics. Running deer with leg positions that show the artists understood the biomechanics of quadruped locomotion. The locations chosen for these paintings weren't random. Deep caves that required dangerous journeys through narrow passages and vertical climbs to reach painting sites. Chambers with specific acoustic properties that amplified sound in particular ways. Spaces where natural lighting created dramatic effects at certain times of day or seasons of the year. These weren't casual decoration projects. They were carefully planned artistic installations that integrated with their environments in sophisticated ways. The social organization required to create these artistic works reveals another layer of Ice Age complexity. Large painting projects required teams of artists working together over extended periods. Someone had to gather and prepare materials, while others planned compositions and executed the actual painting. Lighting had to be maintained throughout long working sessions in the depths of caves where natural light never penetrated. Food and water had to be provided for work crews who might spend days or weeks in underground locations. The cultural significance of these artistic sites extended far beyond their creation. Archaeological evidence suggests they served as gathering places for multiple communities, locations where different groups came together for ceremonies, trade, and social interaction. The paintings themselves might have served as visual libraries, storing information about animal populations, seasonal patterns, and hunting strategies in forms that could be easily understood and remembered. Music and dance traditions that accompanied these artistic gatherings left their own archaeological traces. Bone flutes with finger holes precisely positioned to produce specific musical scales. Percussion instruments made from hollow logs, animal skulls, and stretched hides. rattles and shakers created from gourds, bones, and stones that produced complex rhythmic patterns when used together. The musical scales these instruments could produce weren't primitive noise-making devices. Analysis of surviving bone flutes shows they were tuned to mathematical relationships that created harmonious sounds when played together. The finger hole spacing demonstrates understanding of acoustics principles that allowed for complex melodies and harmonic structures. Some flutes were designed to imitate animal calls so precisely that they could be used for hunting, while others were clearly created purely for musical expression. Dance traditions associated with these musical practices required large open spaces and coordinated movement by groups of performers. Archaeological sites show evidence of cleared areas with specific arrangements of stones or posts that might have marked dance floors or provided reference points for complex choreographed movements. The physical demands of these dances provided excellent conditioning for the athletic requirements of Ice Age survival, while serving important social and spiritual functions. Storytelling traditions that accompanied music and dance were the primary method for preserving and transmitting the vast body of knowledge these communities had accumulated. Epic narratives that could take days to tell in their complete forms, containing detailed information about hunting strategies, weather prediction, tool-making techniques, and social protocols embedded within memorable dramatic structures. These stories weren't just entertainment or education. They were legal systems that established territorial rights, resource allocation rules, and conflict resolution procedures. Genealogical narratives that traced family relationships back through multiple generations served as the foundation for determining marriage eligibility, inheritance rights, and political authority. Creation myths and spiritual beliefs provided psychological frameworks that helped communities cope with the constant stress and uncertainty of their lives. The memorization techniques required to preserve these oral traditions accurately across generations were extraordinary feats of human mental capacity. Storytellers developed mnemonic systems that used rhythm, repetition, and association to maintain precise accuracy in transmission. Changes to traditional stories were carefully controlled and required community consensus, ensuring that crucial information wasn't lost or corrupted through casual retelling. Seasonal ceremonies that marked important transitions in the annual cycle served multiple functions beyond their obvious spiritual and social purposes. These gatherings provided opportunities for different communities to share information about resource availability, weather patterns, and animal movements across vast regions. They facilitated trade relationships and marriage arrangements that strengthened networks of mutual support and cooperation. The timing of these ceremonies was carefully coordinated with astronomical events that provided precise calendrical references. Solstices and equinoxes marked major seasonal transitions, but these Ice Age communities also tracked more subtle celestial cycles that helped them predict weather changes and plan activities with remarkable accuracy. The monuments and markers they created to track these astronomical events show sophisticated understanding of mathematics and engineering principles. Some of these astronomical observation sites were engineering marvels that rival later megalithic constructions. Arrangements of stones and posts that created sightlines for tracking the movements of sun, moon, and stars across the seasonal cycle. These weren't crude approximations, but precision instruments that allowed for accurate prediction of seasonal changes weeks or months in advance. The knowledge systems that integrated astronomical observation with weather prediction, animal behavior, and plant phenology were incredibly sophisticated. These communities understood that the timing of animal migrations was connected to celestial cycles, that plant growth patterns followed astronomical rhythms, and that weather systems had seasonal predictabilities that could be tracked and anticipated. The educational systems that transmitted this knowledge to younger generations were carefully structured to ensure nothing crucial was lost. Children began learning basic observation skills almost as soon as they could walk, developing the ability to notice and remember subtle environmental details that would become the foundation for more complex knowledge later in life. Adolescents served apprenticeships with master specialists that lasted for years, and included both theoretical instruction and hands-on practice. The assessment methods used to evaluate learning progress were rigorous and practical. Young people had to demonstrate not just knowledge, but the ability to apply that knowledge under stress and in challenging conditions. The consequences of incomplete learning were too severe to allow for casual or inadequate instruction. Advanced specialists in various fields developed teaching techniques that maximize learning efficiency while ensuring retention. Visual demonstration combined with hands-on practice, repetition structured to reinforce memory without becoming boring, and evaluation methods that identified learning problems before they became dangerous gaps in knowledge. The integration of different knowledge systems created educational experiences that were both comprehensive and specialized. Every community member needed basic survival skills, but individuals also developed expertise in specific areas that made them valuable specialists. The balance between general competence and specialized knowledge was carefully maintained to ensure both individual capability and community resilience. Innovation in educational methods was encouraged within traditional frameworks that had proven successful over generations. New teaching techniques were tested and evaluated carefully before being adopted widely. The most effective innovations were shared along trade networks and incorporated into the educational practices of distant communities. The psychological understanding these educators demonstrated was remarkable for any era. They recognized that different individuals learned in different ways and adapted their methods accordingly. They understood the importance of motivation and created learning experiences that were engaging and rewarding rather than simply demanding and difficult. The social structures that supported these educational systems were complex and carefully maintained. Master teachers held positions of high status and were supported by the community in ways that allowed them to focus on instruction rather than basic survival activities. The most promising students received additional resources and attention that helped them develop their capabilities to the fullest extent possible. The evaluation of teaching effectiveness was based on practical outcomes rather than abstract measures. Teachers whose students consistently demonstrated superior survival skills and contributed more effectively to community welfare gained reputations that attracted more students and greater community support. Those whose methods proved less effective were encouraged to improve or redirect their efforts toward other valuable activities. The long-term planning that these educational systems required demonstrates another dimension of Ice Age sophistication. Training a master toolmaker, skilled hunter, or weather prediction specialist required years of sustained effort and resources. Communities had to invest in education programs that wouldn't show returns for decades, requiring vision and commitment that extended far beyond immediate survival needs. The cultural continuity that these educational systems maintained across countless generations created stability and progress that allowed for continuous improvement and innovation. Each generation built upon the knowledge of their predecessors while adding their own discoveries and refinements. The cumulative effect over thousands of years was the development of survival technologies and cultural practices that were incredibly sophisticated and effective. The documentation of this educational process in artistic and symbolic forms created permanent records that supplemented oral traditions. Cave paintings that showed proper hunting techniques, tool-making sequences, and seasonal activity patterns served as visual textbooks that could be consulted by multiple generations. Carved symbols and notational systems recorded numerical information and complex relationships in forms that could be preserved and transmitted accurately. The quality control systems that ensured educational effectiveness were embedded in the daily life of these communities. Survival itself provided constant feedback about the adequacy of training and knowledge transmission. Mistakes in education quickly became apparent in practical applications and could be corrected before they became widespread problems. The adaptation of educational systems to local conditions and resources showed flexibility within proven frameworks. Communities in different environments faced different survival challenges and developed educational specializations that reflected their specific needs while maintaining core knowledge that was universal to human survival in Ice Age conditions. The social recognition that accompanied educational achievement provided motivation for excellence and created role models that inspired continued learning and improvement. Master specialists became community heroes whose achievements were celebrated and whose methods were studied and emulated by aspiring students. The integration of education with other community activities maximized efficiency and created natural learning opportunities. Children learned while participating in food processing, tool making, and other essential activities. Adolescents gained experience through graduated participation in hunting, trading, and resource gathering expeditions. The assessment of community educational needs was an ongoing process that involved evaluating both current capabilities and future requirements. Leaders had to anticipate what knowledge and skills would be needed in coming seasons and years and ensure that appropriate training was provided before those needs became critical. The resource allocation for educational activities required careful balancing of immediate survival needs against long-term community development. Materials and time devoted to training had to be justified by the improved capabilities and contributions that resulted from that investment. The coordination of educational activities across multiple communities through trade and social networks created broader learning opportunities and shared standards that improved overall survival effectiveness. Knowledge and techniques developed by one group could be shared with others, creating a cumulative effect that benefited entire regions. The preservation of educational traditions through periods of crisis and hardship required special attention and dedicated effort. During times when survival was most challenging, there was always pressure to focus entirely on immediate needs and abandon longer-term educational investments. The communities that maintained their educational systems through these difficult periods were the ones that survived and thrived in the long term. The spiritual and ceremonial life of these Ice Age communities reveals perhaps the most profound aspect of their humanity. These weren't just people struggling to survive. They were human beings grappling with the same fundamental questions that have haunted our species throughout history. What happens when we die? Why do we suffer? What is our place in the vast, indifferent universe that surrounds us? But their answers to these questions were shaped by their intimate relationship with death, hardship, and the raw power of nature in ways that modern people can barely comprehend. When you live in a world where a single storm can kill your entire family, where a failed hunt means starvation, where injury or illness without modern medical intervention is often a death sentence, your spiritual beliefs aren't abstract philosophical concepts. They're practical frameworks for understanding and coping with realities that could crush the human spirit if faced without some larger meaning. The burial practices of these Ice Age peoples reveal sophisticated beliefs about death and afterlife that required enormous investments of time, energy, and resources. Bodies weren't simply disposed of or abandoned to scavengers. They were carefully prepared for what these communities clearly believed was a journey to another realm of existence. The grave goods found in Ice Age burial sites represent some of the most valuable possessions these communities had. Perfectly crafted tools that had taken months to create, jewelry made from materials that had been traded across thousands of miles, clothing that represented hundreds of hours of skilled labor. These weren't token gestures or simple remembrances. They were provisions for a journey, equipment for a continued existence that required the same careful preparation as any expedition into unknown territory. The positioning of bodies in these graves shows attention to detail that speaks of deep spiritual significance. Individuals buried in specific orientations that aligned with seasonal sunrise positions, suggesting beliefs about the connection between death and the cycles of renewal that governed their world. Hands placed in positions that held tools or weapons, indicating expectations that the deceased would continue to need these implements in whatever realm awaited them. Some burials show evidence of complex ceremonies that must have involved entire communities and taken days or weeks to complete. Bodies covered with thousands of carefully arranged beads, each one individually crafted and placed with precision that suggests ritualistic significance. Red ochre scattered over remains in patterns that mirror astronomical configurations or seasonal markers. Personal possessions arranged in specific configurations that follow rules we can only guess at, but that clearly had profound meaning for the people who created them. The social implications of these burial practices reveal communities that valued individual identity and contribution even in death. Children buried with the same care and elaborate preparation as accomplished adults, suggesting belief systems that recognized inherent human worth regardless of achievements or status. Elderly individuals interred with evidence of community care during extended periods of disability, showing that these societies valued wisdom and experience even when physical contribution was no longer possible. But perhaps most remarkably, some burial sites contain evidence of what can only be described as grief rituals that continued long after the initial interment. Return visits to grave sites where additional offerings were left, sometimes years after the original burial. Maintenance of grave markers and burial structures that required ongoing community effort. Memorial ceremonies that brought people back to burial locations for seasonal observances or anniversary commemorations. The psychological functions these spiritual practices served were crucial for community survival. Grief, if left unprocessed, could incapacitate individuals whose contributions were essential for group survival. The elaborate mourning rituals these communities developed provided structured ways to experience and eventually move beyond the devastating losses that were inevitable parts of Ice Age life. The belief systems that emerged from this constant confrontation with mortality weren't focused on avoiding or denying death, but on finding meaning and continuity despite its inevitability. Creation myths that explained why the world was harsh and dangerous, but also why human beings had the strength and intelligence to survive in it. Heroic narratives that celebrated individuals who had made extraordinary contributions to community survival, creating role models and inspiration for future generations. The shamanic traditions that developed within these communities created specialized roles for individuals who served as intermediaries between the human and spiritual worlds. These weren't simple medicine men or fortune tellers, but sophisticated practitioners who combined deep knowledge of psychology, pharmacology, and social dynamics with spiritual insights that helped communities navigate the psychological challenges of their existence. The training required to become a shaman involved years of intensive education in plant medicines, astronomical cycles, weather prediction, and human behavior. These individuals had to master not just the technical aspects of their practices, but the performance skills necessary to create powerful psychological experiences for community members who needed spiritual healing or guidance. The altered states of consciousness that were central to shamanic practice weren't casual recreational activities, but carefully controlled spiritual technologies that served specific therapeutic and social functions. Plant medicines that could induce visions, breathing techniques that altered brain chemistry, sensory deprivation or overstimulation that created profound psychological experiences. These practices required extensive knowledge of human physiology and psychology to be used safely and effectively. The integration of shamanic practices with community decision-making processes provided spiritual validation for crucial choices about resource allocation, territorial movements, and conflict resolution. Major decisions weren't made purely on practical grounds, but were subject to spiritual evaluation that helped ensure community consensus and commitment to chosen courses of action. The healing traditions that shamans maintained combined spiritual practices with sophisticated understanding of herbal medicine, surgical techniques, and psychological therapy. These practitioners could set broken bones, treat infections with plant-based antibiotics, perform minor surgical procedures, and provide counseling for individuals struggling with depression, anxiety, or trauma. The diagnostic techniques used by Ice Age healers were remarkably sophisticated, combining careful observation of symptoms with understanding of how different conditions affected the body's systems. They could differentiate between various types of fevers, recognize the early signs of infections that could become life-threatening, and identify nutritional deficiencies that required specific dietary interventions. The pharmaceutical knowledge these healers possessed was extensive and precise. They knew which plants could reduce fever, which could stop bleeding, which could induce sleep or alertness, which could ease pain or reduce inflammation. They understood dosages, preparation methods, and the timing of treatments that maximized effectiveness while minimizing dangerous side effects. The surgical capabilities of Ice Age medical practitioners included procedures that wouldn't be attempted again until modern times. Trepanation, the practice of drilling holes in skulls to relieve pressure from head injuries, was performed with stone tools and techniques that show success rates comparable to modern neurosurgery. Bone setting and joint manipulation that restored function to injured limbs. Wound cleaning and suturing that prevented infections and promoted healing. The psychological aspects of Ice Age healing practices were as important as the physical interventions. Healers understood that recovery often depended as much on the patient's mental state and social support as on medical treatment. They developed therapeutic rituals that engaged entire communities in the healing process, creating powerful psychological environments that promoted recovery. The training of new healers involved extensive apprenticeships that combined theoretical knowledge with hands-on practice under expert supervision. Students learned not just techniques, but the judgment required to assess complex cases, the communication skills needed to work with frightened or resistant patients, and the emotional resilience necessary to deal with cases where healing wasn't possible. The ethical frameworks that guided healing practices were sophisticated and carefully maintained. Healers took responsibility not just for their successes, but for their failures, and were expected to continuously improve their knowledge and skills. The most respected healers were those who could honestly acknowledge the limits of their abilities and refer cases to other specialists when appropriate. The integration of healing practices with spiritual beliefs created holistic approaches to health that addressed physical, psychological, and social factors that influenced recovery. Illness wasn't seen as simply a mechanical problem to be fixed, but as a disruption of the individual's relationship with their community and their environment that required comprehensive intervention. The documentation of healing knowledge in oral traditions, artistic representations, and symbolic systems ensured that medical expertise could be preserved and transmitted across generations. Songs that contained precise information about plant identification and preparation. Paintings that showed anatomical details and surgical techniques. Symbol systems that recorded treatment protocols and patient histories. The quality control systems that maintained standards in healing practices were based on practical outcomes and peer review. Healers whose treatments consistently failed to help patients lost community support and were expected to improve their skills or pursue other activities. Those whose methods proved most effective gained reputations that attracted patients from distant communities and opportunities to train new practitioners. The research and development aspects of Ice Age medicine involved careful experimentation with new treatments and systematic evaluation of their effectiveness. Healers tested new plant medicines on themselves before using them on patients. They observed and recorded the effects of different treatments and modified their techniques based on results. The specialization within healing practices allowed individual practitioners to develop expertise in specific areas while maintaining basic competence across the full range of medical needs. Some healers focused on traumatic injuries from hunting accidents. Others specialized in childbirth and women's health issues. Still others developed expertise in treating the chronic conditions that affected elderly community members. The collaboration between different types of healers created medical systems that could address complex cases requiring multiple forms of intervention. Physical healers worked with spiritual practitioners to provide comprehensive treatment that addressed all aspects of a patient's condition. The most challenging cases might involve teams of specialists working together over extended periods. The adaptation of healing practices to seasonal and environmental conditions required flexibility and creativity within proven therapeutic frameworks. Summer treatments that relied on fresh plant medicines had to be modified for winter use when only dried or stored preparations were available. High altitude or extreme cold conditions required adjustments to standard treatment protocols. The resource management aspects of healing practices required careful planning and allocation of scarce materials. Rare medicinal plants had to be gathered at optimal times and preserved properly for use throughout the year. Specialized tools and equipment had to be maintained and replaced regularly. Time and energy devoted to healing activities had to be balanced against other community needs. The social status of healers within Ice Age communities reflected the crucial importance of their services and the extensive training required to master their skills. Successful healers enjoyed high status and were supported by the community in ways that allowed them to focus on their medical practices rather than basic survival activities. The teaching responsibilities of master healers extended beyond training formal apprentices to educating community members about basic health maintenance, injury prevention, and emergency treatment techniques. Everyone needed to know how to handle common injuries, recognize serious symptoms that required expert attention, and provide basic care during emergencies when healers weren't immediately available. The innovation within healing traditions was encouraged within frameworks that ensured patient safety and community welfare. New techniques were tested carefully and evaluated systematically before being adopted widely. The most effective innovations were shared with other communities and incorporated into regional medical traditions. The documentation of case histories and treatment outcomes created knowledge bases that could be consulted for similar cases in the future. Healers developed systems for recording patient information, treatment protocols, and results that allowed for continuous improvement in medical practice and training of new practitioners. The integration of healing practices with other community activities created natural opportunities for health education and preventive care. Food preparation techniques that maximized nutrition and prevented spoilage. Work practices that reduced injury risk. Living arrangements that promoted health and prevented disease transmission. The territorial and political aspects of Ice Age life required diplomatic and military capabilities that were as sophisticated as any later civilization developed. These communities weren't isolated bands wandering aimlessly across the landscape. They were organized societies with defined territories, complex relationships with neighboring groups, and systematic approaches to resource management and conflict resolution. The territorial boundaries that these groups maintained weren't arbitrary lines drawn on maps, but carefully negotiated agreements that balanced resource access with population carrying capacity. Hunting grounds were allocated based on seasonal animal movements, with different areas reserved for specific types of hunting at particular times of year. Quarry sites for tool-making materials were shared according to complex protocols that ensured sustainable extraction while preventing conflicts over access. The enforcement of these territorial agreements required both diplomatic skills and military capabilities. Boundary violations weren't simply ignored or handled through casual negotiation. They were serious breaches of intergroup agreements that could escalate into conflicts threatening the survival of entire communities. The protocols for handling territorial disputes were elaborate and carefully maintained, involving formal procedures for investigation, negotiation, and resolution. The military technologies these groups developed weren't crude weapons for random violence, but sophisticated systems designed for specific tactical purposes. defensive fortifications that use natural terrain features enhanced with constructed barriers to create nearly impregnable strongholds. Weapons systems that could be deployed quickly and effectively by coordinated groups of warriors. Communication methods that allowed for rapid coordination of defensive responses across large territories. The training of warriors involved years of intensive physical and tactical education that created military specialists capable of protecting their communities against threats from both human enemies and dangerous predators. These weren't weekend warriors or casual fighters, but professional soldiers whose skills were maintained through constant practice and periodic testing in real combat situations. The intelligence gathering systems that supported military planning were extensive and sophisticated. Scout networks that monitored neighboring territories for signs of hostile activity. Trade relationships that provided information about distant threats and opportunities. Communication protocols that could rapidly transmit crucial information across vast distances. The strategic planning capabilities of Ice Age military leaders involved complex calculations about resource allocation, seasonal timing, and coordination with allies that required deep understanding of logistics, geography, and human psychology. Major military operations had to be planned months in advance, with detailed consideration of weather patterns, animal migrations, and the availability of supplies and reinforcements. The weapons technologies developed for Ice Age warfare were precisely engineered for maximum effectiveness within the constraints of available materials and manufacturing techniques. Spear points designed specifically for penetrating human opponents rather than animal prey. Shields constructed to provide maximum protection while remaining light enough for extended combat. Armor systems that combined multiple materials to create flexible protection that didn't interfere with mobility. The tactical formations and combat techniques used by Ice Age warriors were sophisticated and carefully practiced. Coordinated group attacks that maximize the effectiveness of individual weapons. Defensive formations that could protect vulnerable community members while allowing warriors to maintain offensive capabilities. Ambush techniques that use terrain and environmental conditions to create overwhelming advantages against larger enemy forces. The psychological warfare aspects of Ice Age military practice included intimidation techniques, deception strategies, and propaganda methods that could demoralize enemies and strengthen the resolve of friendly forces. War paint and ceremonial dress that created fearsome appearances. Battle cries and ritual behaviors that boosted warrior confidence while frightening opponents. Deception tactics that misled enemies about troop strength, intentions, and capabilities. The alliance systems that connected military groups across vast regions created networks of mutual defense that could respond to threats too large for individual communities to handle alone. These weren't casual agreements, but formal treaties with specific obligations, protocols for requesting assistance, and procedures for coordinating joint military operations. The logistics of military operations required careful planning and resource management that rivaled the complexity of major hunting expeditions. Warriors had to be equipped with weapons, armor, food, and other supplies for campaigns that might last for weeks or months. Transportation systems had to be organized to move equipment and personnel across difficult terrain in all weather conditions. The medical support for military operations included specialized combat medicine techniques and personnel trained to treat battlefield injuries under dangerous conditions. Field surgery capabilities that could save lives and return wounded warriors to combat. Evacuation procedures that could remove seriously injured personnel from active combat zones to safer areas where more extensive treatment could be provided. The communication systems used during military operations allowed for coordination of complex maneuvers and rapid response to changing tactical situations. Signal systems using smoke, fire, or reflected light that could transmit messages across long distances. Messenger networks that could carry detailed information between separated units. Code systems that prevented enemies from understanding intercepted communications. The intelligence analysis capabilities of Ice Age military leaders involved systematic evaluation of information from multiple sources to create accurate assessments of enemy capabilities, intentions, and vulnerabilities. Interrogation techniques for questioning prisoners or defectors. Counterintelligence methods that prevented enemies from obtaining crucial information about friendly forces and plans. The post-conflict procedures for dealing with victory or defeat included protocols for treating prisoners, dividing captured resources, and establishing new territorial agreements. These weren't arbitrary decisions made in the heat of battle, but systematic approaches that considered long-term consequences and the need to maintain stable relationships with surviving enemy groups. The training of military leaders required extensive education in strategy, tactics, logistics, and diplomacy that prepared them to handle the complex challenges of Ice Age warfare. These commanders had to master not just the technical aspects of combat, but the leadership skills necessary to maintain discipline and morale among warriors facing life or death situations. The integration of military activities with other community functions ensured that defensive capabilities were maintained without compromising essential survival activities. Military training was scheduled around hunting seasons and resource gathering activities. Warrior obligations were balanced with contributions to food production and other community needs. The innovation in military technologies and techniques was encouraged within frameworks that ensured effectiveness and safety. New weapons designs were tested thoroughly before being adopted for general use. Tactical innovations were evaluated in training exercises before being implemented in actual combat situations. The documentation of military knowledge in oral traditions and symbolic systems preserved tactical information and strategic wisdom for future generations. Battle narratives that contained detailed information about successful strategies and tactics. Ceremonial objects that encoded information about alliance relationships and territorial agreements. Teaching songs that helped young warriors learn complex combat techniques and formations. The ethical frameworks that govern military conduct included rules about treatment of non-combatants, acceptable tactics, and post-conflict behavior that maintained community honor while achieving military objectives. These weren't modern concepts of international law, but practical guidelines that recognized the need to maintain relationships with other groups even after military conflicts. The resource allocation for military activities required careful balancing of defensive needs against other community priorities. Materials and labor devoted to weapons production and fortification construction had to be justified by the level of threat and the availability of resources for other essential activities. The seasonal aspects of military planning reflected the constraints and opportunities created by Ice Age environmental conditions. Summer campaigns that took advantage of better weather and longer days. Winter defensive preparations that could sustain communities through periods when offensive operations were impossible. Spring mobilizations that coordinated with resource gathering and territorial expansion activities. The psychological preparation of warriors for combat included mental conditioning techniques that helped them overcome natural reluctance to kill other human beings and maintain effectiveness under extreme stress. These weren't simply motivational speeches, but systematic psychological training that prepared warriors mentally and emotionally for the realities of life or death combat. The social support systems for military personnel included provisions for families of warriors killed in combat, medical care for wounded veterans, and recognition for exceptional service that maintained community morale and encouraged continued military service. These communities understood that effective military forces required comprehensive support systems that extended far beyond the battlefield. As we stand at this point in our journey through Ice Age life, having explored their shelters, their hunts, their tools, their art, their spiritual beliefs, and their military capabilities, we begin to see the full scope of what these remarkable people accomplished. They didn't just survive one of the most challenging periods in human history. They created sophisticated civilizations that laid the foundation for everything that would follow. But we've only scratched the surface of their story. The daily rhythms of family life, The intricate relationships between different communities, the trade networks that spanned continents, the innovations that allowed human beings to spread across the globe during the most hostile climate conditions ever faced by our species, all of this and more awaits our exploration. In our next segment, we'll delve deeper into the intimate details of how these Ice Age families raised their children, maintained their relationships, and created the social bonds that held their communities together through the darkest and most challenging times in human history. The bonds that held Ice Age families together weren't forged in comfort or convenience, but in the crucible of shared survival, where every member, from the youngest child to the most elderly grandparent, played a vital role in keeping the group alive. These weren't the nuclear families we recognize today, but extended kinship networks that might include 30 or 40 individuals spanning 4 generations, all living in close quarters where privacy was a luxury that simply didn't exist. Children in these Ice Age communities weren't coddled or protected from the harsh realities of their world. From the moment they could walk steadily, usually around 18 months, they were integrated into the daily survival activities that kept their families alive. A 3-year-old might be responsible for keeping the fire fed with small pieces of fuel, understanding instinctively that letting the flames die could mean death for everyone in the shelter. By age 5, children were skilled at identifying edible plants, tracking small animals, and recognizing the subtle environmental signs that warned of approaching storms or predators. The educational process for these children was unlike anything we see in modern societies. There were no formal schools, no structured curriculum, no separation between learning and living. Instead, education happened continuously through observation, imitation, and gradual participation in adult activities. A young girl might spend years watching her mother prepare hides, learning through observation the precise techniques for scraping, softening, and waterproofing that would someday keep her own family warm and dry. A boy would shadow his father and uncles during tool-making sessions, gradually progressing from simply watching to helping with simple tasks to eventually crafting his own implements under expert guidance. But here's what makes this educational system so remarkable. These children weren't just learning practical skills, they were absorbing vast amounts of environmental knowledge that modern people can barely comprehend. They could identify hundreds of different animal tracks, not just what species made them, but how old the tracks were, whether the animal was healthy or injured, what it had been eating, and where it was likely to go next. They understood plant life cycles so intimately that they could predict, weeks in advance, exactly when and where specific food sources would become available. The memory techniques these children developed were extraordinary. Without written language, everything had to be stored in human memory with perfect accuracy. Children learned to memorize genealogies that traced family relationships back through dozens of generations, not just as interesting family history, but as practical information that determined marriage-age obligations. They memorized starability, territorial rights, and alliance patterns that served as navigation tools, weather prediction systems, and seasonal calendars. They learned hundreds of stories that contained encoded survival information, presented in narrative forms that made crucial knowledge memorable and engaging. The physical development of Ice Age children was equally impressive. By age 10, most children possessed strength, endurance, and coordination that would challenge modern adult athletes. They could travel 20 miles in a day over difficult terrain, climb trees and rock faces with casual confidence, and swim in ice-cold water that would incapacitate most modern people. This wasn't the result of formal exercise programs, but simply the natural outcome of daily life that required constant physical activity for survival. The social skills these children developed were as important as their physical and intellectual capabilities. Living in close quarters with extended families meant learning to navigate complex interpersonal relationships, resolve conflicts diplomatically, and contribute to group harmony even during times of extreme stress. Children who disrupted group cohesion or failed to control their emotions appropriately could endanger everyone's survival. so social education was as rigorous and demanding as any other aspect of their training. The coming-of-age ceremonies that marked the transition from childhood to adult status weren't simple celebrations, but intensive testing periods that evaluated whether young people had mastered the skills necessary for full participation in adult society. These tests weren't theoretical examinations, but practical demonstrations of survival capabilities under challenging conditions. A young person might be required to survive alone in the wilderness for weeks, using only basic tools to obtain food, shelter, and protection. They might have to demonstrate their ability to track and kill dangerous prey, craft complex tools from raw materials, or navigate across unfamiliar territory using only natural landmarks and celestial guides. The gender roles that governed Ice Age society were more complex and flexible than many people assume. While there were certainly activities that were typically associated with men or women, survival often required everyone to master a broad range of skills regardless of gender. Women were frequently skilled hunters, particularly when it came to tracking smaller game or using traps and snares that required patience and precision rather than brute strength. Men often possessed detailed knowledge of plant foods and medicine, skills that were crucial during times when hunting was unsuccessful or when community members needed healing. The marriage customs of these Ice Age communities reflected the practical realities of survival in small, isolated groups. Marriage wasn't primarily about romantic love, though affection certainly played a role, but about creating alliances between families, ensuring genetic diversity, and establishing networks of mutual support that could be crucial during times of crisis. Young people often had significant input into marriage decisions, but the final choices were made with careful consideration of how the union would affect the survival prospects of both families involved. The courtship rituals that preceded marriage were elaborate affairs that allowed young people to demonstrate their skills and worthiness as potential partners. These weren't casual social events, but serious evaluations where individuals could showcase their hunting abilities, craftsmanship, knowledge, and social skills. A young man might present his intended bride with tools he had crafted himself, demonstrating not just his technical abilities, but his understanding of what would be most useful for their future life together. A young woman might display clothing she had sewn, artwork she had created, or her knowledge of medicinal plants and food preparation techniques. The wedding ceremonies themselves were community-wide celebrations that served multiple functions beyond simply recognizing the new marriage. They were opportunities for different families to strengthen relationships, exchange gifts and resources, share information about distant territories and resources, and reaffirm social bonds that held the larger community together. These celebrations often lasted for days and included competitions, storytelling sessions, trade negotiations, and ceremonial activities that reinforced cultural values and traditions. The honeymoon period for newly married couples wasn't a romantic getaway, but an intensive period of cooperation where they learned to work together effectively as a survival team. New couples often received their own section of the family shelter or, if resources permitted, help in constructing their own dwelling. This transition to independence was gradual and carefully supported, with extended family providing guidance, resources, and backup support while the new couple developed their partnership skills. Pregnancy in the Ice Age wasn't just a personal matter, but a community concern that affected resource allocation, work assignments, and survival planning. Pregnant women continued to participate in most daily activities until very late in their pregnancies, but their tasks were gradually modified to reduce risks while maintaining their contributions to group survival. The entire community had a stake in ensuring successful births, because every new member represented both additional survival capability and the continuation of accumulated knowledge and genetic diversity. The prenatal care available to Ice Age women was surprisingly sophisticated, based on thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about human reproduction and the factors that influence successful births. Experienced midwives understood which plant medicines could ease morning sickness, reduce the risk of miscarriage, or prepare the body for easier labor. They knew dietary requirements that ensured proper fetal development and maternal health. They had developed techniques for determining the position of babies in the womb and methods for addressing complications that might arise during delivery. Childbirth itself was a community event that involved not just the mother and midwives, but extended family members who provided physical support, emotional encouragement, and practical assistance. The birthing process took place in specially prepared areas of the shelter that were arranged to provide maximum privacy and comfort while still allowing for community participation and support. The techniques used during labor and delivery were refined through generations of experience and represented the accumulated wisdom of countless women who had successfully brought children into this harsh world. The immediate postnatal period was crucial for both mother and baby, requiring intensive care and support from the entire community. New mothers needed time to recover from childbirth while establishing breastfeeding relationships with their babies. The community had to reorganize work assignments to compensate for the new mother's temporary reduction in capability, while ensuring that both she and the baby received adequate nutrition and protection. Infant mortality in Ice Age communities was undoubtedly high by modern standards, but it was lower than we might expect given the harsh conditions these people faced. The intensive care and attention that new babies received, combined with sophisticated understanding of infant needs and dangers, helped many children survive their vulnerable early months. Breastfeeding practices were optimized to provide maximum nutrition and immune protection. Clothing and shelter arrangements were designed to keep infants warm and safe. The entire community participated in protecting and nurturing new babies, understanding that their survival was essential for the group's long-term continuation. The naming ceremonies for new babies were significant events that formally welcomed new members into the community and established their identities within the complex web of kinship relationships that govern social life. Names weren't chosen casually, but were selected to reflect the circumstances of birth, family history, hopes for the child's future, or spiritual beliefs about the child's role in the community. These naming ceremonies often included predictions about the child's likely talents and future contributions based on observations of early behavior and family patterns. Child-rearing responsibilities were shared among extended family members in ways that ensured children received diverse education and strong emotional bonds with multiple adults. While parents held primary responsibility for their children, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and older siblings all played important roles in education, supervision, and care. This distributed approach to child rearing provided backup support when parents were injured, ill, or killed, and ensured that children learned from multiple perspectives and skill sets. The disciplinary approaches used in Ice Age child rearing were necessarily strict, given the life or death consequences of many childhood behaviors. Children who failed to follow safety rules, disrupted essential activities, or endangered the group through carelessness faced immediate and memorable consequences. However, discipline was balanced with understanding and teaching, helping children understand not just what they shouldn't do, but why certain behaviors were dangerous and what alternatives were acceptable. The play activities that occupied children's free time weren't just entertainment, but sophisticated educational tools that taught essential survival skills in engaging ways. Children played hunting games that developed tracking skills, hand-eye coordination, and understanding of animal behavior. They engaged in competitive activities that built strength, endurance, and tactical thinking. They created art projects that developed fine motor skills, aesthetic sensibility, and cultural knowledge. Even their toys were miniature versions of adult tools that allowed children to practice essential skills in safe, age-appropriate ways. The storytelling traditions that were central to child education weren't simple bedtime stories, but complex narratives that contained multiple layers of information. Surface narratives provided entertainment and moral instruction, while deeper meanings conveyed detailed survival information, historical knowledge, and cultural values. Children learned to listen at multiple levels, extracting different types of information depending on their age, experience, and current educational needs. The seasonal cycles that governed adult activities also structured children's education and development. Summer months provided opportunities for extensive travel and exposure to different environments, teaching children about resource availability, territorial boundaries, and relationship with other communities. Autumn was a time for intensive learning about food preservation, preparation for winter, and the importance of planning and resource management. Winter months offered extended opportunities for indoor activities like tool making, storytelling, and the development of artistic and intellectual skills. Spring brought renewal and the chance to apply lessons learned during the previous year to new challenges and opportunities. The healthcare available to Ice Age children was surprisingly comprehensive, based on detailed understanding of childhood diseases, nutritional needs, and developmental requirements. Healers knew which plant medicines were safe and effective for treating childhood ailments, how to recognize and address developmental problems, and when to intervene in cases of serious illness or injury. Preventive care included dietary guidance, protective practices, and environmental modifications that reduce children's exposure to diseases and hazards. The integration of children into religious and spiritual activities helped them develop the psychological frameworks necessary for coping with the harsh realities of their world. Children participated in ceremonies, learned prayers and ritual practices, and absorbed beliefs about death, suffering, and the meaning of existence that provided comfort and guidance during difficult times. These spiritual traditions weren't imposed on children, but were presented as natural parts of life that helped explain and cope with experiences that might otherwise be overwhelming. The evaluation of children's progress and development was ongoing and comprehensive, involving not just parents, but the entire community in assessing whether young people were acquiring the skills and knowledge necessary for adult survival. This evaluation process identified children who showed particular talents in specific areas, allowing for specialized education that developed those abilities to their full potential. It also identified children who were struggling with certain aspects of development, ensuring they received additional support and attention in those areas. The transition from childhood dependence to adult independence was gradual and carefully managed, with young people taking on increasing responsibilities and challenges as they demonstrated their capability to handle them. This process ensured that by the time individuals reached full adult status, they possessed not just the skills necessary for survival, but the confidence and judgment needed to make life or death decisions under pressure. The family structures that emerged from these child-rearing practices were incredibly strong and resilient, capable of maintaining cohesion and effectiveness even under extreme stress. The bonds formed between family members weren't just emotional attachments, but practical partnerships based on mutual dependence, shared knowledge, and proven ability to work together effectively under challenging conditions. The knowledge transmission systems that connected generations ensured that crucial survival information was preserved and improved over time. Each generation built upon the accumulated wisdom of their predecessors while adding their own discoveries and innovations. Children who learned from grandparents who had survived particularly difficult periods gained access to knowledge and experience that might prove crucial during future crises. The social mobility within Ice Age communities was based on demonstrated ability and contribution, rather than inherited status or wealth. Children who showed exceptional skills in hunting, craftsmanship, healing, or leadership could achieve high status regardless of their family background. This meritocratic approach ensured that the most capable individuals were positioned to make crucial decisions and provide essential services to their communities. The cultural continuity that these family systems maintained across generations provided stability and identity that helped communities survive through periods of extreme hardship and change. The stories, traditions, and values passed from parents to children created shared frameworks for understanding the world and responding to challenges that might otherwise fragment communities under stress. The adaptation of family structures to changing conditions showed remarkable flexibility within proven frameworks. Families could expand or contract based on resource availability, incorporate orphans or refugees from other groups, and modify their internal organization to address new challenges while maintaining the essential relationships and knowledge transmission systems that ensured their survival and success. The emotional bonds that held these Ice Age families together were as important as the practical partnerships that governed their daily activities. Love, loyalty, and mutual care provided the psychological foundation that enabled people to endure hardships that might otherwise break their spirits. The family celebrations, rituals, and traditions that marked important life events created memories and shared experiences that strengthened these emotional connections and provided motivation for continued cooperation and sacrifice. The decision of when and how to move an Ice Age community wasn't made lightly around a cozy fire with everyone voicing their opinions. It was a calculated gamble that could determine whether 30 or 40 people lived through the next season or perished in the frozen wasteland between territories. These weren't nomadic wanderers drifting aimlessly across the landscape. These were strategic planners who understood that mobility was both their greatest asset and their most dangerous vulnerability. The timing of these moves had to account for dozens of variables that modern people can barely comprehend. Weather patterns that could trap a moving group in deadly blizzards, animal migrations that might provide hunting opportunities along travel routes or leave certain areas completely barren of game, the availability of water sources during different seasons, the condition of pregnant women, elderly family members, and young children who might not survive the physical demands of long-distance travel. The logistics of moving an entire Ice Age community required planning and coordination that would challenge modern military units. Every possession had to be evaluated for its necessity versus its weight. Tools that were essential for survival had to be carried, but luxury items or backup equipment might have to be abandoned. Food supplies had to provide adequate nutrition for the journey, while remaining light enough to transport over potentially hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. The transportation technologies these people developed were marvels of engineering efficiency. Sleds that could carry heavy loads over snow and ice, while remaining maneuverable enough to navigate through forests and around obstacles. Pack frames that distributed weight evenly across human backs, while allowing for quick access to essential items. Waterproof containers that protected crucial supplies from rain, snow, and river crossings that were inevitable parts of most journeys. But perhaps most remarkably, these communities had developed techniques for transporting their most vulnerable members across terrain that would challenge healthy adults. Elderly individuals who could no longer walk long distances were carried on specially designed litters that distributed their weight among multiple carriers. Pregnant women near delivery had to be provided with comfortable transportation that didn't endanger their pregnancies. Infants and small children required protection from weather and constant care while traveling through dangerous territory. The route planning for these moves involved detailed knowledge of geography that extended far beyond immediate territories. Scouts had to understand not just the physical landscape, but seasonal changes that affected travel conditions. River crossings that were safe during dry seasons might become impossible during spring floods. Mountain passes that were navigable in summer could become death traps when winter storms hit. Desert areas that provided adequate water during certain months might be completely uninhabitable at other times. The communication systems that coordinated these moves were sophisticated and reliable. Advanced scouts who traveled days or weeks ahead of the main group, checking conditions and identifying problems before they became crises. Rear guards who protected the community from pursuit while monitoring conditions behind them. Signal systems that allowed separated parts of the group to maintain contact and coordinate their movements, even across miles of wilderness. The decision-making processes that govern these moves involve careful consultation with specialists who possess different types of expertise. weather predictors who could forecast seasonal changes weeks or months in advance, hunters who understood animal behavior and migration patterns, healers who could assess whether vulnerable community members could survive the journey, elders who remembered previous moves and could share hard-won wisdom about what worked and what didn't. The psychological preparation for these moves was as important as the physical planning. Moving meant leaving familiar territory where every rock, tree, and water source was known and trusted. It meant venturing into regions where dangers might be hidden and resources uncertain. The fear and anxiety that accompanied these decisions could paralyze communities or lead to poor judgment that endangered everyone involved. The rituals and ceremonies that preceded major moves served multiple functions beyond their obvious spiritual significance. They provided psychological frameworks that helped community members process their fears and commit to the shared endeavor. They reinforced social bonds that would be crucial during the challenges ahead. They served as final checks to ensure that all preparations were complete and that nothing essential had been forgotten or overlooked. The leadership structures that emerged during these moves often differed from normal community hierarchies. Travel leaders who possessed specialized knowledge about route finding and journey management might assume temporary authority over individuals who held higher status during settled periods. The most skilled hunters might take charge of security decisions. The most experienced healers might gain authority over decisions that affected community health and safety. The contingency planning that preceded these moves had to account for dozens of potential disasters that could strike without warning. What would happen if key leaders were injured or killed during the journey? How would the community respond if they encountered hostile groups along their route? What procedures would they follow if they arrived at their intended destination only to find it occupied or unsuitable for settlement? The supply management during these moves required constant attention and careful rationing. Food had to be allocated to ensure that everyone maintained strength for travel, while preserving enough reserves to survive if the journey took longer than expected. Water had to be found and purified regularly, often from sources that were unfamiliar and potentially dangerous. Fuel for fires had to be gathered opportunistically while traveling, because stopping specifically to collect firewood could add days or weeks to journey times. The medical care available during these moves was necessarily limited, but still remarkably sophisticated. Healers carried portable medicine kits that included treatments for the most common travel-related injuries and illnesses. They knew techniques for treating altitude sickness, dehydration, infected wounds, and broken bones, using only materials that could be found along travel routes. They understood how to modify their treatments for the stress and unusual conditions that accompanied long-distance travel. The security measures that protected moving communities were comprehensive and constantly maintained. Guards who patrolled the perimeter of camps during rest stops. Scouts who ranged ahead to identify potential threats before they became immediate dangers. Rear guards who watched for pursuit while ensuring that no community members fell behind or became separated from the main group. Communication systems that could rapidly alert the entire community to approaching dangers. So there you have it. 20,000 years ago, our ancestors didn't just survive the most hostile environment in human history, they mastered it. They built homes that could withstand killing cold, developed hunting strategies that brought down giants, created art that still moves us today, and raised families bound by love and necessity in equal measure. They weren't primitive cave dwellers scraping by on luck and desperation. They were engineers, artists, healers, teachers, and innovators who turned a world of ice and death into a homeland where human civilization could take root and flourish. The next time you flip a switch or adjust your thermostat, remember these remarkable people who conquered winter itself with nothing but stone, bone, fire, and an indomitable human spirit that refused to surrender. Fire, and an indomitable human spirit that refused to surrender.